particularly in the context of seeds, there may be other areas also. Because I'm not very sure whether the Competition Commission has had any such cases, but certainly the courts have intervened in the case of seeds. And indeed, something like O.P. Jindal should ask questions about the Seeds Act, because the powers of court intervention emanated from something like the Seeds Act. The next issue I want to flag is the issue of procedures, and I'm particularly talking about patents now. I'm not talking about procedures in terms of the patent offices. They have improved, they need to improve even further, and they will be spoken about. I mean procedures in terms of getting hold of patent lawyers. Patent lawyers are not exactly a competitive market. It's a very small incestuous set, and for a small-time person, getting hold of a patent lawyer who is affordable or an IP lawyer who is affordable is not very easy. And it is certainly extremely difficult if it is outside Delhi or Mumbai. Getting hold of a labor lawyer is much easier. The last point I want to flag, and I think it's an important point, and I'm flagging this because after all O.P. Jindal is an educational institution, but I'm not suggesting for a minute in view of what I'm about to say that you start a school. I think part of the problem, a large part of the problem, starts with the day when children in India enter kindergarten. The day you enter kindergarten, you are told, you are instructed, you are commanded never to ask why. You are not to ask why. You are not meant to be curious. You are not meant to be inquisitive. You are meant to accept as the gospel truth whatever is taught to you by your teachers, whatever is taught to you in the textbooks. You have to confirm. You have to succeed. You are not allowed to fail. The point, of course, is you cannot encourage success unless you encourage failure. You cannot encourage an IPR tradition unless you encourage students to ask why and be curious. There was a tradition of intellectual property in India. There was a tradition when students were encouraged to ask why for various reasons I need not get into. That's been killed. If we do not correct that bias in the educational system, O.P. Jindal can have as many conferences as it wants, but the number of patent applications filed by Indians in India will continue to be somewhat low, and we will continue to have cases where dissertations on intellectual property which have earned PhD degrees will turn out to have been plagiarized. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tom. Yeah. Oh, couple of questions. Okay, so that's great. 5 minutes, so we can take a couple of questions, if we may. Can you please raise your hand and sort of maybe introduce yourself or comments? Since we have, started the conference on a very positive note, we want to. Okay.
My question is that I take your point about the fact that the legal frameworks of this legislation dictates attempts to develop a culture relating to innovation and using the legal framework to permeate aspects of innovation. But the the larger question that I have for you is that, is it possible right now the government is demonstrating its intention by efforts to create a number of entrepreneurial initiatives, promoting the culture of innovation through, creating young people to come together and, even the banking structure, lots of such institutional avenues are created for that. Do you think this has a potential to build a culture in the future for IP?
Yes, of course. I agree with what you have said, because some of the things that we are talking about are transcend in nature. Somewhere down the line it has changed. It will probably be 20 years before all of this changes. There is one area though where I do not yet detect any visible change, and that is what I said about the attitude that we normally have in the area of education. Yes, education is opening up. It has opened up already at the school level, it's opening up elsewhere. But this tradition of question, that so far, I do not detect any clear signs. And somewhere down the line, the pressure for change comes not from you and me, comes from the likes of the schools.
Well, really, thank you so much. Dr. Roy, as some of you know, has always been somebody who has spoken truth to power, and we're very fortunate that he is traveling across the world from academia and practice and now in the government. So I'm very, very grateful to him for taking the time out. Thank you so much for being here.
Happy panel photo, group photo kar.
So we are still waiting for Mr. Rajiv Agarwal, but in the meantime, I want to highlight something very important, that we are doing this conference. It's the 5th one that JIRICO is doing on innovation for shared prosperity, and this edition is being hosted with Center for Protection of Intellectual Property at George Mason University in the US, and I would really like to thank two very distinguished law professors at GMU, Adam Mossoff and Sean O'Connor. They are really academic giants in the field of history of property and intellectual property rights. We were expecting Kevin Madigan, who's also with the Center for Protection of IP at George Mason, but unfortunately he was not able to get his passport back in time from DC. I want to thank Kevin also. I emailed him. It's unfortunate that he couldn't be here. We have a very short clip that Kevin sent to us, 2 to 3 minute clip, which we are going to play very soon. Is it ready? Can you play it, please?
Good morning, everyone, and greetings from Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Center for the Protection of Intellectual Property, I'd like to welcome you all to the 5th International Conference on Innovation for Shared Prosperity. My name is Kevin Madigan, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for the Protection of Intellectual Property at Antonin Scalia Law School. And we couldn't be more delighted to be co-sponsoring this conference with the Juno Initiative on Research and IP Competition. I'm truly sorry that I couldn't be there with you all today to hear from the many distinguished speakers and to participate in the important panel discussion that will follow. I experienced some unexpected delays in my visa approval process, which prohibited me from traveling this week. While it's unfortunate, I'm sure you all can relate to the bureaucratic holdups that sometimes occur in these situations. But I wanted to join in this morning with Professor Gupta and Professor Bharadwaj in welcoming you all in saying a few short words about why today's conference is so important and timely. As we are all aware, technological advancement is occurring at an unprecedented rate. With the advent of 5G and the Internet of Things, we're now seeing patented high technology finding its way into more and more household appliances, automobiles, medical devices, robotics, and even apparel. It's not hard to see that in the very near future, everything around us, and maybe even eventually in us, will be constantly transmitting information back and forth. Now, in order for these transmissions to occur efficiently and to remove barriers to connectivity, it's necessary to establish industry-wide criteria that results in the harmonization of implemented technologies. Arriving at these standards and coming to appropriate licensing agreements is not always an easy process, with developers and implementers often at odds over what technologies should be adopted. This issue will be discussed in more detail a little later today in the second panel. But the issues tie into the overall theme of this conference, which is examining the history of intellectual property and innovation, trying to better understand the complexities of our current IP landscape, and then adding to a dialogue that will lead to harmonization across world borders and that will ultimately benefit all nations, stakeholders, and society as a whole. Finally, I want to thank everyone at JIRICO Global University and JIRICO for organizing this program. While I'm sad I can't be there, I look forward to continuing the partnership between our organizations and co-hosting events like these in the future. Thank you all for coming, and I hope that you enjoy the program.
So we are still waiting for Mr. Agarwal. So let me tell you the context and the background of this conference. The idea of this conference was really conceived several months ago. Actually, for the very first time when my colleague Aviroop was visiting George Mason. I think this was sometime last year or last year. And then I got the opportunity to have an interaction with very senior and distinguished people in the IP center of George Mason in Virginia. And we realized that there are a lot of things academically that both our institutions share. We've dedicated a lot of our efforts towards scholarship, towards understanding how technology, innovation, rule of law, strength of institutions, intellectual property rights system, all of them need to be better understood from various different perspectives, be it law, economics, finance, ethics, governance, public policy, and so on. But we really truly believe, both our institutions, that in order to understand larger socio-economic development of our societies, particularly India, we need to understand the notion of shared prosperity a bit better. It's both of these terms individually have a lot of meaning, and we need to understand it very carefully in the context of intellectual property. We must broaden our canvas really when we are talking about India in the context of IP. We need to understand that institutions really matter. Evidence-based policy making really matters. We need to understand that creativity, even if it's at a school level, which is what Mr. Debroy was alluding to, that matters. Technology matters. The laws and policies that we end up framing matter a lot, and they have a long-term implication on how creativity is enhanced and innovation can be induced. And in a sense, this is what JIRICO is trying to do. We're trying to bring all of this together under one academic roof, and we're trying to make a meaningful contribution in the scholarship of innovation and IP. For the students sitting here, have you ever wondered how countries get wealthy over a period of few decades? Or how and why nations fail over a period of 1 or 2 centuries? It's a very interesting and a thought-provoking question. Why do nations fail, or why do societies prosper the way it has happened and evolved in the last few centuries? Now, it's partly, I want to highlight that word, because of very well established mechanisms and institutions of property, physical or intellectual, and the entire enforcement machinery and the thought process behind it. We understand very well that property rights boost and they beget specialization and trade, which then boost job creation, growth overall, and that ends up enhancing the productivity and the larger economic surplus that societies create. One of our friends of JIRICO and a senior professor at Stanford, Professor Steve Haber, summarizes it very neatly in one of his claims, which is that there are no wealthy countries with a weak property rights system, and there are no poor countries with a very well-functioning, robust intellectual property system. That's something to think about. It's not a mere correlation. So let me spend a couple of minutes in telling you what this conference is about, what are the 3 sessions and how they link together. The subtitle, if you read there on the screen, it's called Past Tense, Present Perplexed and Future Perfect. We took some time in stretching it and to add a bit more spice to it, if you will. But what we really want to understand in the very first session, and we have a fantastic lineup of speakers for that session, we want to understand how societies, India in particular, has evolved in terms of innovation, technology, contribution of innovation activities, technology evolution to larger socioeconomic growth of our country, how nations have embraced different forms of IP protection, and what's the outcome? Because in order to understand where we need to go, we need to understand where we've come from. So we're going to focus a lot on the previous few decades, and I think Zorina is going to take us all the way back to the 18th or the 19th century. Then in the second session, we are going to focus on what's happening what started to happen relatively recently in the last 1 or 2 decades. For the IP students sitting here and the other experts and practitioners, it's a very interesting time. We are grappling with a dilemma which is quite interesting in nature. As technology, and we're all connected to it, and digitization is bringing all of us together, connectivity is playing a very big role. Legal disputes and policy incongruence is kind of is bringing in these frictions and creating gaps and differences, not just between scholars, but between nations, between organizations, between firms, between inventors. So we are going to be discussing a lot of these frictions and different viewpoints, particularly in the context of patent law in the second session, focusing on what really happened at the turn of the century, last decade and this decade. That would bring us to the third and the last session, which we are calling as Future Perfect. We're trying to be optimistic. We really want to address a very simple question, particularly for policymakers and academics. What do we do? What are the questions that we need to answer going forward with all these technological disruptions that we are seeing? Some of them bring good news, some not so much, depending on the context of the society and its people. But some of the issues that really motivated our interest in structuring the last session the way it is answering questions like, is the real intelligence in boosting our efforts in understanding artificial intelligence better? Is it all about machine learning, or do we really need to push more about learning new machines and new breakthroughs? Should we worry about Internet of Things, or should we also at the same time worry about all the things that are on the internet? Talking about data here. So these are some of the issues which are already prominent in certain other countries, particularly in Europe. And we will see a lot of emphasis and a lot of focus on these issues as we go forward in the industry, in policy circles, and of course in academia. So this is how the conference is structured. I would really like to invite the Vice Chancellor, Professor Rajkumar, for his remarks and opening comments.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to welcome all the speakers and other guests who have joined us today for this 5th conference. And also, of course, thank you to all the students who have traveled over 2 hours to come from campus to be part of this morning's proceedings. I'm not an intellectual property lawyer, so important disclosure. But I want to say that the effort to create an opportunity for promoting innovation as our aspiration to have shared prosperity is not something that's not inherently controversial, in the sense that developing countries around the world, including India, but also many parts of Africa, Latin America, other parts of Asia, the historical evolution of legal and institutional frameworks, both domestic and international, in the field of IP has not necessarily happened without strong resistance. And the heart of that resistance is, to a large extent, the inability of the international community in particular to articulate the public good and common good dimensions of IP regime. And so countries like India in particular, which already has a very, let's say, evolving structure surrounding the rule of law, we are continuing to struggle to establish a society based on the rule of law. Our colonial experience has also given us a very, let's say, adverse impact surrounding the legislation itself. And so laws are not necessarily seen to be empowering dimensions of society, but laws can actually be used to create new forms of structures of power. And so one of the things that students of law and even policymakers who are promoting the development of IP regimes in developing countries in particular need to be conscious of and be deeply sensitive about the concerns expressed by developing countries. And I think it is only fair to say that as India and countries like India are increasingly participating in the global economic aspirations, it needs to take greater responsibility, and in that process be conscious of the effort to build an intellectual property regime. But then this intellectual property regime should also be conscious of how we can have a more inclusive set of factors that will be brought to bear when legal and institutional frameworks are created. I also want to mention that as students who are studying law, it's also important for you to be conscious of the other disciplines and perspectives that need to be brought into the conversation. And I speak here as a lawyer who is also very conscious of the fact that laws and lawyers tend to dominate the conversation. And this is something which we need to be very conscious of because there are many other disciplines which are deeply embedded in our effort to build a society that will promote innovation. And in this case, our JIRICO team has called it as innovation for shared prosperity. Within the framework of shared prosperity, there are aspects of public service and common good and public good which are deeply embedded. And I think it is only fair to say that lawyers have a very big role to play to bring in other disciplines into this conversation. Economics is obvious, but I will also say that sociology and anthropology and political science and all those areas and aspects have a very big bearing on the nature and the structure of the intellectual property regime that we are planning to create. It's also important for us to, one of the big challenges that countries like India are facing today is that how do you protect innovation and historically evolved innovation that may not have received legal and intellectual property protection from the past, and how those let's say traditional knowledge and aspects of traditional knowledge which have developed over centuries, to what extent there is a responsibility on the part of the international community to protect and empower such knowledge that have been created over centuries in India, parts of India and Asia and Africa. And so there is a larger sense of responsibility that we need to bring to this conversation. And I can't help but draw upon a very distinguished political and moral philosopher's work, Michael Sandel, who teaches at the Harvard University's Department of Government. And a few years ago, Michael wrote a fascinating book, which I would strongly recommend all law students here to refer to it. The title of the book is called What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets. And Michael in this book has very compellingly argued that as we move towards building a society, and by the way, he makes a very important distinction between the market economy and the market society. And Michael is in favor of creating a market economy, but he makes a distinction between a market economy and a market society, where market economy is where we have goods and services available in a competitive framework, and that's fine. But the question of a market society is where everything that we do is measured in monetary terms. And he actually gives a number of case studies from across the US but also around the world, and he talks about the consequence of a market society in which he says that there are twofold consequences of a market society. One is institutionalized forms of inequalities, and another is institutionalized forms of corruption. Both are an inevitable consequence of our attempts to build a market society. And he has given a number of both moral and political, philosophical, theoretical underpinnings to it, but also case studies from around the world. I would like to bring that conversation into our discussion surrounding IP regime, and then to recognize to what extent we can actually promote the development of IP structures and IP law and IP framework for our ultimate goal to, of course, protect the innovator and the innovations through that, but also create a culture of innovation, but conscious of the fact that the ultimate goal is to promote and build what the organizers have quite rightly called shared prosperity. And this sense of shared prosperity becomes a very critical and thematic focus for the future of the development of IP regime, because without building a broader level consensus in the world, particularly among the developing countries, our efforts to create a strong IP framework will either be met with strong and public and stiff resistance, or alternatively it will be a lip service when it comes to enforcing and implementing IP laws. We have already seen that in countries like China and India, and as China and India grows and even works towards building its own structures for promoting the rule of law, IP regime should become more and more conscious of the inherent problems that are being faced by these countries when it comes to balancing the development of IP and the public interest and the public good. So with those words, I am very delighted that JIRICO, which began as a relatively small project and initiative promoted by 3 faculty members, Ashish, Indra and Vishwas, over the years has brought into their fold many more outstanding professors from Jindal Global Law School and OP Jindal Global University, and I'm very delighted that a good number of students are increasingly seeing a lot of interest in the field. As Vivek mentioned, that we ultimately have to create a culture of innovation, and different institutions and organizations have a different set of role to play. And as a university which is deeply committed to promoting innovation and entrepreneurship, it is only fair that we help our students and be empowering our students to think in terms of how they can participate and help build IP culture and a culture of innovation in India and beyond. I'm particularly grateful to many other colleagues from our partner institutions, the George Mason University, but also others who have responded to our invitation, who have come from different parts of the world to be part of this effort. I want to particularly recognize the presence of a good friend Archie, who used to be Managing Director of Goldman Sachs, who is with us today. He will be speaking at the valedictory session. So once again, congratulations to JIRICO. And as Indra mentioned, JIRICO has been a shining example of what Indian legal academia could do when it comes to promoting research and knowledge creation and advocacy, and creating an intellectually vibrant environment where such conversations can happen with less dogma but more substance. Thank you.
I would now request Professor Vishwas Devaiya to, today is both, sort of actually is a very sad day, and you probably would remember, you would always remember, of course, without question, Professor Dr. Shamnath Bashir, and we have dedicated this conference to him, a very good friend of the university, and all academics, in the area of IP and beyond. I will request Professor Devaiya to take it forward. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. As you know, the entire conference is actually dedicated, to Professor Dr. Shamnath Bashir. That's kind of hate to kind of refer to him in the past, and it's always been a struggle to kind of, to kind of deal with the idea that he's no longer with us. On 8th of August, late in the evening, news kind of trickled in saying that our wonderful friend Shamnath had actually passed on, and some of us even refused to believe. I mean, given the times that we are in, you don't like to kind of believe what you read in the media and what you listen to, right? So I was left with a hope that the information is not true, and for quite some time, it took me a few days to kind of even get to the realization that he's not along with us. But I still refuse to believe the idea that Shamnath has left, because Shamnath has actually left imprints of himself in a whole lot of people. Some of us in the gathering here actually know him personally in varied capacities. For the students who've actually heard about Professor Shamnath, the two major things that he actually stands for is access to legal education and his fight for justice. I don't necessarily mean in terms of intellectual property rights, because to actually bundle him within the framework of IP would be a grave injustice to someone like Shamnath, right? So he's fought for access to medicines, he's intervened at various points in terms of on issues of fairness, access to knowledge, more specifically the Oxford University versus the Delhi University case. He was a Shell scholar in Oxford, and went on to actually be a Wellcome Trust scholar and get his doctorate from Oxford. He was a visiting professor in George Washington, and in those days, while he felt a little bored about being away from India, he thought of something very interesting, and that is the spicy IP started as a blog, now is probably one of the most influential IP resources, not just in India, but globally as well, right? He's also been an MHRD chair in NUJS in the past, and he was one of the most energetic MHRD IP chairs who was not necessarily satisfied with the idea of actually doing research, but also said, hey, we need to actually intervene in the legal processes, not only in terms of policy making, but also being a friend of the court and intervening in certain aspects. And while a stint in NUJS seemed like he is the IPR chair, someone would have been satisfied with that. Shamnath, being the restless soul, decided that, hey, I mean, look at the law schools. Law schools are largely people coming from affluent backgrounds. Where are the people, students who specifically do not come from privileged backgrounds? And the idea of increasing diversity by increasing access kind of, took root and took shape in NUJS. And as you know, he's been instrumental in not only creating idea as an entity, but also kind of, finding the right talent to get to the law school and nurture them, not merely in terms of financial support. I've personally witnessed instances where he's actually sat with some of the idea scholars after they've gotten to law schools to kind of, give them a sense of being within the law school. So and he's of course never ever been afraid of speaking truth to power. He's one man who's probably gotten a whole lot of National Law School vice chancellors to actually think in terms of access to legal education. He's even taken them to the courts in the past. That's pretty much, there's a whole lot of stuff that Shamnath has actually done. He's touched each of our lives in different ways, and I would actually kind of call upon two such individuals, Prashant and Professor Unni, to actually share a few words about Shamnath.
Thank you, Vishwas, for, I think you wonderfully captured most of what Shamnath's done here. I've known Shamnath since 2007. I was a final year law school student, and I had just written an email to him out of the blue asking him for some question on the Novartis case, which was in its initial stages then. And like Shamnath being the big-hearted guy that he was, he wrote back to me saying, why don't you co-author an article that I'm writing on the topic? And that's how I tumbled into IP as a career. After that, I joined the blog, and then I started milking him for many, many recommendation letters for universities and scholarship funds, and he was always there to help. I just wanted to mention a few things about, because this is an IP conference, I thought I'll mention a few of his pet peeves with the IP system and how he viewed the IP system. And also the role of academia in the larger space. One of his passions was, getting legal information out to outside academia, to people in a language that they could understand. As academics, I know all of us are under pressure to publish in peer-reviewed journals or law reviews, and very often we forget to connect to get our message out there to the larger masses. And there is, if you want a particular idea to gain some kind of legitimacy, you need to reach out of the the haloed circles of academia, and that's how Spicy IP was born. And I know Spicy IP is it's a very polarizing blog. You may love it, you may hate it, but you can't ignore it. And I think Shamnath really succeeded in his mission in getting IP out there to, to law students and to a much more diverse readership consisting of scientists, people in the music industry. It's really quite amazing how he's managed to achieve this over a period of about 12 years. The second passion that Shamnath has was transparency, both as as a virtue, as a value and as a means to the end. In fact, two of the cases that he was fighting before the Delhi High Court involved transparency of the IP system. One was regarding a provision under Indian patent law where you need to disclose, where patentees need to disclose exactly how much they are earning through sales of their patented invention. The government of India wasn't enforcing that obligation properly, so Shamnath eventually took them to court. That case has been languishing for some time in the Delhi High Court. The second case was on how much the patent office was charging to get information out of the patent office. So if you want to get a certified copy of a document from the patent office, it costs about 4,000 rupees. And if you do it under the RTI Act, it's just 2 rupees. So basically the patent office was charging 2,000 times more, which then made it very expensive for civil society organizations to intervene in patent opposition proceedings. So that was another case that he took the government to court for. The two other values were, legal education. I think Vishwas captured it beautifully when he said that one of the reasons he started IDI was when he saw the law schools that he was teaching in. All of us were basically from the same background, same caste, same class background. And while most of us would just sit and complain about it in our offices, Shamnath was the guy who went out there and did the hard work. The initial students that they got, were from Pelling in Sikkim, which involved a lot of travel training. I had personally accompanied him for one of his sessions at a blind school in Hyderabad, and he was, pivotal in getting some of these kids into law schools. The last value is, it's a lesser known passion of his, but it was actually one of his first cases which we had done when we were in NUJS, which was maintaining the independence of the judicial system. So the main IP tribunal that the government of India had set up to adjudicate key IP cases was actually, the manner in which it was structured was, it was tightly controlled by the government. So we wrote a couple of pieces on it, and then Shamnath, being Shamnath, decided that time to go to court. So we challenged the constitutionality of that tribunal before the Madras High Court, and he won in 2015. Key provisions of the IPAB were struck down of its parent statute. I could go on and on about Shamnath. I think I could write a book about his life. But one of the things that we saw after his passing away is, the outpouring of, tributes. And the one common value that came out in all that outpouring is his kindness and his ability to help and his willingness to help everyone. It's a trait that is not usually spoken of when a lawyer passes away. But I guess that was Shamnath's rare quality. That's the thing that, he managed to touch everybody's lives. Whoever got in whoever wanted help from him, he was always willing to help. But he was also always ready to fight for what he believed in. Thank you again, Vishwas, for giving me this opportunity to talk about it.
If Professor Unni could say a few words.
Session we all really wanted to avoid because this is so painful, and I still remember Thursday, 8th of August, around 6:30, we were getting a lot of emails saying, is this true? So I suddenly called up my friend who's doing live law. He said, we are getting information on this, possibly, they are trying to, it seems there was an accident, hopefully he may be safe. I knew this because then I told him there is still a lot of hope, because Shamnath, I know he used to travel, he used to go for trekking and all earlier days. So he said, let us hope for the best. Weather is very bad, but by 7:30 things were confirmed, and as Vishwas and Prashant was saying, nobody really wanted to believe this. And my association with Shamnath is about 20 years. I know him from 1999 when he joined Anand and Anand. And I think even today, Anand and Anand, during every August, organize a Rajanand mood competition. So during that time only I met him. And he had just joined Anand and Anand. And both of us from the same state also helped. But the kind of affection and care which Shamnath gives to everybody is phenomenal. Words cannot describe that. And many of you might not know, I actually joined Anand and Anand in 2001. I was there for a very short period, thanks to Shamnath. And I still remember the meeting with Praveen Anand happened at, I would say, about 12:45 in the night, because Mr. Praveen Anand said that before I meet you, Shamnath should be with you. So at that time, they had two offices. One was in Nizamuddin and the other one was in Gurgaon. So Shamnath was in Gurgaon and he came all the way at around 11:45, 12 just to make sure that I get the job. I'm talking about the year 2000. And it is like, so this was the first instance where we could really feel that kind of warmth from him. Then as an academic, I don't think I have to explain anything on him. Everybody knows the scholarship which he is known for, and the leadership. An institution like IDEA, it's not something which we people generally think about. All of us know these law schools have been there from 1988 onwards. Everybody knew that students are coming from a particular kind of background, all think alike, all look alike, but nobody did anything for this. So we had to really wait for somebody like Shamnath to start this process. I remember in 2009-10, that period it started. There were a lot of people who were extremely skeptical, oh, it will not work, because law schools actually survive on the fees given by students. It might work in IITs and IIMs who give a lot of scholarships. This is not going to work here. But Shamnath made this happen. And the other thing which I again had experience with him was, I am in Calcutta, so Shamnath was also in Calcutta for almost from 2008 to 2014. So that way we had a lot of interaction. I'll be generally going and meeting him. But something which always keeps Shamnath apart is the kind of, he might be extremely busy, he might be in some forest in Siliguri, the next day he will come back and start writing an article, then he will again go back. So this is the kind of care and attention which he gives to, as you're selling, to all the students, and even the ideas to the students who got through IDEA and all. I'm sure we really missed him. We will be missing somebody like Shamnath forever. I hope let his soul rest in eternal peace. That's the only thing which we can pray at this stage. Thank you so much.
Now, if I may request everyone to observe a minute of silence. Thank you, everyone. We'll now break for tea and reconvene for the first thematic session.